Benvenuti. Welcome to Casa Italiana at zerilli-marimò at New York University. It's my great pleasure. That's actually my seat. I'm sorry. Thank you for your patience. It's a big crowd for us to handle. I remind you that we also have an overflow room upstairs with a large screen where you can follow the conversation sitting down if you prefer rather than standing up. I'm not surprised, and Grazia and I were not surprised of the turnout, of the success of this evening. Of course, there is a lot of interest surrounding the person of Andrew Bolton, his work, what he has done for the Metropolitan Museum, and his future plans. And I'm delighted that Grazia D'Annunzio invited him to be here with us as part of the series Addressing Style, a series that Grazia created for Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò together with Eugenia Paulicelli. I'm very grateful for the work that Grazia does curating this series. Throughout the year, we have at least 4 encounters, and we go from fashion, style, architecture, and anything beautiful that Italy produces today. So it's a great pleasure for me to have these special guests tonight that I would say is one of the persons that has done the most to bridge the gap between fashion and the arts in general. And the result of his work is the beautiful exhibits that he puts together as curator of the Costume Institute. I don't want to take away from Grazia the pleasure to officially introduce to you Andrew Bolton. I would just like to invite you to go online if you're not. So I'm not inviting you to turn off your devices before you had the information to go online. Let people know that you're here. And we are streaming live both on our website and on our Facebook page. Enjoy the evening, and please help me welcome Grazia D'Annunzio and Andrew Bolton.
You sit there. I have new microphone, so can you hear me? Okay, good. Welcome and welcome back to Casa Italiana. I'm Grazia D'Annunzio, and I'm extremely honored to have here tonight Andrew Bolton. And we have a little problem with the okay, thank you. So you have a double Andrew here. Andrew Bolton is the Wendy Yu Curator in charge of the Costume Institute. He's a quintessential British gentleman. He studied anthropology in England. He worked at V&A before coming in 2002 at the Costume Institute, first as the associate curator, and then as a curator in 2006, and then he became a curator in charge in 2016 when Harold Koda, his predecessor, retired. And actually Harold, another dear friend, came here, actually was the first guest of my series. So I'm really happy now to have Andrew here with us. Andrew worked alongside Harold Koda on several exhibitions at the Costume. Some of them, you probably know them very well, are Chanel, Poiret, Schiaparelli, and Prada. Alone, he worked on great successful exhibitions like Anglomania, Superheroes, American Woman, Alexander McQueen, Savage Beauty, Punk, China Through the Looking Glass, Manus per Machina, and Rei Kawakubo. The last exhibition that he curated, Heavenly Bodies, broke many records. More than 1 million visitors, is the most attended show at the Costume Institute, and is the #1 by now at the Met ever. So after Tutankhamun, bravo. After Tutankhamun, we have the Vatican, and it's not over yet. So maybe we're gonna have a little battle, and maybe we're gonna have great surprises.
Battle of the gods.
Yes. So first of all, before starting talking about the exhibition that he did so far, when did you start being interested in fashion, and why?
It was really, I grew up in a very small town in England, in Lancashire, and it was at a time when most of the style magazines were being published, like The Face and ID and The Blitz. So I was really lucky in terms of living in a period which was really driven by street style, music and subcultural movements like the punks and new romantics. Oh, sorry. My mic's slipped down. Is that better? Yeah? Yeah.
Better.
Yeah, so I was sort of saying that how lucky I was to grow up at a time in England, which was really a conflation of different subcultural styles. So the new romantics, punk, and it was really music and subculture that got me into fashion. And I never thought I could actually study it at university. In fact, when I was growing up, it wasn't really a discipline you could study. So I went in a different direction.
Do you consider yourself an historian, a fashion historian, or more of an anthropologist who has a very interested approach in fashion?
I think probably an anthropologist. I trained as an anthropologist. So I think even at university I was focusing on the anthropology of dress. And I was much more interested in the comparison between cultures rather than the differences. So I was always really interested in how other cultures dress themselves, in terms of, and the messages that those clothings told. So I think, yeah, I'm more of an anthropologist, a sociologist, yeah.
You came in 2002 at the costume. So can you please explain to the audience a brief history of this institution, and also I'm interested to see how this institution raised up in the curatorial hierarchy of the Met from the 50s on.
Yeah, well, the short story is that it started off as the Museum of Costume Art in the West Village. And through two philanthropists, the Levison sisters, they brought the collection to the Met, the Costume Institute, in 1947, I think it was. On the condition that the fashion community would support the existence of the Costume Institute at the Met. So it's always been an independent curatorial department, which is why the Gala raises money for our department. So the Gala really is our biggest fundraiser. So we're the only department in the museum that raises its own funds.
Diana Vreeland. Diana Vreeland was the legendary director of American Vogue during the 60s. And then when she was fired, she went to the Costume Institute and really resurrected that very silent, dormant situation and institution, right?
I think so. And I think, through her contacts and just also through her imagination, she brought a really different flavor to the Costume Institute. And the shows really were extraordinary. But then you listen to some, she always did these extraordinary voiceovers. So when you went through the exhibition, you could put on a headphone and hear Mrs. Vreeland talk. And the comments were extraordinary. She did one, it was on the fashions of Africa. And you'd be putting on the headphone and she'd say, turn left and you get into the souk. And that was it. So there was no sort of historical background to it. It was just pure sort of fantasy and imagination. And I think when Richard and Harold started in the 80s, it really was them who put fashion as a really serious academic discipline on the map, and through their shows. And they did wonderfully poetic shows like Bloom, which was about flowers in fashion. And the idea, one was called 2 by 2, which was about male and female fashion and the idea of gender specificity. And so it really was through them that costume industry became a serious academic discipline, I think.
Tell us the most important pieces and most valuable pieces that we can find at the costume.
Well, we have over 30,000 pieces in our collection, and they date primarily from the 18th century through to the present date. I think specific collections, we have the Millicent Rogers collection, an amazing woman of style, and the way that she would wear Schiaparelli with folkloric dress. So she was an extraordinary dresser. So her collection is really important. Our Charles James collection.
And Millicent Rogers was also a great Charles James client, yes.
And we have all of the archive of Charles James in the museum. And I think that's probably one of our most important collections, I think, the Charles James. And Harold did an amazing exhibition a few years ago on Charles James.
If we want to come to the Costume Institute, which is actually located in the basement of the Metropolitan, not a nice, location, but it's okay. You recently you recently renovated it, right?
We did. It's hard to renovate a basement because it's still a basement. But we tried to make it more flexible. So what we wanted was a sort of tabula rasa, a white space where it was more flexible, but it's still a basement.
Yes. But sometimes in the basement you can find treasures. And actually I like the basements. Who can come to the Costume Institute? Apart from the people that they want to see the exhibition organized by the Costume Institute. If I want to come to the Costume Institute, what can I do?
We have an amazing library. We have the amazing collection which you can visit. So you make an appointment to see the collection in the library. So there's different. It really functions as an educational institution. So there's other ways of access than just the exhibitions.
Okay, let's start now to explore the Heavenly Bodies, the last exhibition that you curated, and here we have two Tom Brown. This is a lovely dress that were done by the Sorelle Fontana, and it's a dress that I particularly like because it was done in 1956 for Ava Gardner, and then Pietro Gherardi, who was the costume designer of Fellini La Dolce Vita, brought it, and he did a replica for the movie. And it's called Il Pietrino, Il Pretino, the little priest. Okay, this is another great installation with a great Valentino in the middle. Okay. The exhibition is divided in two sections. One is at the Met main building. The other one is at the Cloister, which is another great location, and you have to go to the Cloister, absolutely. So, and it's still on, so you have time to also come back again if you have already seen it. So tell us a little bit about the genesis of the exhibition and why you decided to have this exhibition split it in two different venues.
Well, it was actually inspired by an article that came out in the New York Times about 4 years ago, which was talking about how the arts were going through another culture war, as the culture wars of the 80s and early 90s, which is a great fear for any curator, the idea of politics getting too involved within art. So it really was that was the initial inspiration. And the original idea was actually focused on 5 religions: Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Catholicism, and to have fashions juxtaposed throughout the museum with those galleries with those particular religious beliefs. That was the original idea. And then when I began working on the exhibition, the imbalance was too great towards Catholicism. So most designers really gravitated towards Christianity and Catholicism more than the other 4 religions. So there was a huge imbalance between the other 4 religions. So it just seemed inappropriate. And then when the Vatican came on board, we decided just to focus on Catholicism. And in terms of the 2 venues, we wanted it to unfold almost like a pilgrimage. So you start off in the Anna Wintour Costume Centre, then the Medieval Sculpture Hall, the Byzantine Galleries, then the Medieval Sculpture Hall, and then the cloisters. So the idea was that the conceit for the exhibition was this sort of idea of a pilgrimage.
Do you have any specific requests from the Vatican?
It was extraordinary. Anna Wintour always says that the Met is like the Vatican in terms of the complexity, and there's no comparison. It literally took 2 years and over 15 visits to get the loans. And we started off really modestly. We only wanted sort of like we 6 to 8 loans. We thought that's all we could get. And the hardest part was actually getting to the right people to talk to, because we went through so many different channels until we found Father Padre, and we found him, and everything became much easier. But the only request they had once we talked about the exhibition was that the Vatican pieces would be shown separately from the high fashions. So that was the only sort of request, only condition. And then another request was that the Vatican pieces be shown in a space devoid of any meaning. So they didn't really want the pieces in the Medieval Sculpture Hall or the cloisters. They wanted it to be in a sort of a white cube space that had no meaning, so all the meaning was focused on the clothing. So that was more of a request than a condition. But the only condition was that the fashions would be separate from the
you have the fashion displayed in the medieval court at the Met, and also some other items in the all over the cloisters. So, which items did you decide to put where?
I think it was really the space. And again, one of the conditions, we collaborated with the curators in the medieval sculpture department. And again, one of their conditions was that the garments, none of the existing curatorial spaces would change. So we had to choose pieces that would relate to specific objects within the existing galleries, which was difficult because the show began to be, it became more site-specific. It wasn't about the history of fashion's engagement with Catholicism. It was more about how fashion can be integrated within the Met's collection and how these medieval works of art can inform the fashions and how the fashions can, in a way, enliven the objects on display. But in terms of how we separated it, we wanted to focus on the more ceremonial aspects of the Catholic Church in the medieval sculpture galleries and the more reflective, monastic part of the Catholicism in the cloisters. So in a way, the two flip sides of Catholicism.
In fact, look at this wonderful Balenciaga. That was the last clothes that Balenciaga designed in 1967, and it's a wedding dress. I remember when I saw you that you told me that you were about to prepare the show, and you were so excited about this loan, right?
This one in particular, because it's sort of in its sort of fashion history, sort of sainted this as being the one seam wedding dress, and the idea and what we all thought that it was made from one piece of fabric with one seam. And it's actually made from two pieces of fabric with 3 seams and 4 shaping seams. But nevertheless, it's an extraordinary tour de force of the haute couture. It's an extraordinary piece. And it's sort of the holy grail of fashion, this one.
And this is another wonderful installation, the Valentino dress. So I would like to ask you, the Diller, Scofidio and Renfo is the architectural firm who worked with you in putting together the show, and they organized the display. And the Diller, Scofidio and Renfo is the architectural firm who also worked for the Charles James exhibition in 2014. So how did you work with them, and how did you interact with them?
They were extraordinary, and we started off. We interviewed about 6 architecture companies, and we settled on DSR mainly because the others were they focused on more cliches of the Catholic Church, so the idea of incense or wax, and it was a bit Hammer House of Horror, so it just wasn't terribly sort of sophisticated, and then DSR really focused on the idea of Catholic space. And what does Catholic space mean, and how do we experience Catholic space? Which is really through lighting. When you think about going into a Catholic church, it's the lighting that is so transformative. So that really was what really sold them on me, was the idea that the actual installation was really quiet and respectful of the existing architecture. But the experience was all this idea of lighting. It was this very sublime sort of experience and very quiet and contemplative. So it was really that what swung it for me.
Yeah, some of the mannequins are also suspended. They look like floating in the air, just to give even more of a celestial atmosphere. And talking about the mannequins, I don't know if you can notice, the face of the mannequins have the eyes closed. So who did the mannequins? And
we worked with, mannequins are always difficult because, fashion is meant to be seen in motion, and so you lose a dynamism when you put clothes on a mannequin, so they're always complicated. But we wanted the face to be more prayerful and more sort of meditative. So we worked with a company called Proportion in London, and we gave them all these images of Michelangelo's Pieta in St. Peter's Basilica, and we really wanted the face to look like that, or at least indicate that. And after the sort of 6th sculpt, we realized that the sculptor was no Michelangelo. So we just sort of said, well, why don't we just close the eyes and make her look more just really prayerful and reflective. And then when it came to the male mannequin, which came later, we sort of learnt our lesson. So we thought to ourselves, who looks most like Jesus? And we thought, Jared Leto. So Jared Leto became the model for Jesus.
Okay. And so next time you go to the Met, to the new exhibition that Andrew will curate, be careful to notice, to observe the mannequins, because every exhibition has different mannequins, and mannequins are very important in, presenting fashion. So I know that you're going to have a talk at the Met this coming Sunday about sacred space. So can you tell us a little bit about it, because I'm interested?
Yeah, it's going to be Jim Martin. Father Jim Martin is an extraordinary priest and has written an awful lot recently as op-eds in the New York Times, but is a really incredible thinker, Jesuit. He's leading the panel, and it's with myself and Barbara Boehm, who's the curator of medieval art at the cloisters, and then Bishop Teague, who curated an exhibition at the Venice Biennale about sacred spaces. So it's focused on the exhibition, but it's also focusing on the idea of what sacred spaces mean, particularly within the Catholic tradition.
Mm. At what time?
2 o'clock.
2 o'clock. We will be there. Okay. Now, I would like to investigate the second exhibition that we're going to present. I don't follow any chronological order here. So the second exhibition is totally different from this one that you have just seen, and is a great departure from the heavenly creatures. And is an exhibition that you curated in, I don't remember, 2000 and something, and is about punk. Punk, great fashion revolution who still has a strong impact in today's fashion. So how did you come up with this idea?
I mean, it was
because you are the antithesis of punk.
I tried to be a punk growing up, but it was mainly the fact that punk has had such a huge influence on fashion since it emerged in the mid-1970s. And if you think about some of the major sort of trends within fashion, the idea of deconstructionism, Le Mode Destroy, it all started with punk. So I think in terms of the influence of punk on high fashion, it's been probably one of the most leading influences in the last 30 years. Mm-hmm. So we really wanted to focus on that idea, the particular tropes of punk and how they've affected contemporary fashion. And that was the idea. But it was, I think people was expecting it to be a show about punk per se, which the first galleries were, and I really underestimated how sort of possessive punks are over their punkdom. And there was boycotts outside the museum, and it became really controversial. But the idea was how punk chaos evolved into couture, the catwalk. So really from the street style into high fashion.
Think of the Versace safety pins ball dress that became iconic of Versace and was worn by Elizabeth Hurley. Exactly. So let's see that is the Versace dress. And I really like the way you presented the genesis of punk in the first galleries when you make a dichotomy between London punk and New York punk. So can you tell us a little?
Yeah, again, it was important because New York really, even though the Brits like to claim that they invented punk, it really was in America, in New York, through CBGBs and Richard Hell, and he was the one who really began wearing safety pins, even though they became adopted by Johnny Rotten. So I really wanted to focus the origins of punk within the New York sort of music scene and how it became more of a stylistic vehicle within London, within England. So less about music and more about style. Really. But yeah, it was important to showcase the origins of punk.
Was it difficult to have this exhibition approved by the director of the museum?
Well, Tom Campbell claims he was a punk. So, and he showed me a photograph with green hair. So for him it was nostalgic. So he liked the idea.
Because Andrew also put in these two toilets in the Metropolitan Museum, and there's a recreation of the CBGB's infamous men's
and this really came out of a conversation with Richard Hell, and because I was talking about CBGBs, and he said all the action happened in the toilets. So we recreated the toilets, and we tried to do music, so it was as if you were in the toilets, and the music was further away. So it really came out of a conversation with Richard Hell.
Are you an anarchist at heart?
Maybe, yeah.
Okay. So In 2007, along with Harold Koda, you presented the work of the first modern designer, Paul Poiret, known as the king of fashion in this country and simply like Le Magnifique, l'Extraordinaire in Paris. So tell us how important is Poiret in the fashion, history, and how revolutionary.
I mean, he really did invent modern fashion. So he freed women from the corset, and he was the first one to drape material from the shoulders. So the idea of draping fabric on the body, as opposed to the tailoring tradition of the 19th century. So he really did invent the idiom of modern fashion. And the exhibition really came out of there was a treasure trove, and one of Poiret's great granddaughters found a chest in her attic of clothing, and it all belonged to Denise Poiret, so Paul Poiret's wife. And she was his muse, so he would create the purest forms of his expression, his creative expression for Denise Poiret. And there were pieces, they were iconic, but there were also pieces that people had never seen before. And we were successful in buying about 40 pieces at auction. So it really revolved around Denise Poiret and her influence on Paul Poiret. And she was this very free woman, sort of the opposite to Chanel's Garçon. I think that what Poiret struggled with towards the end of his career was that he couldn't really embrace the new woman of the 1920s, the idea of Garçon. And there's a famous, probably a mythical exchange between Chanel and Poiret walking in the street, and Chanel's wearing her black dress, and Paul Poiret says, "Madame, for whom do you mourn?" And she says, "For you, monsieur," because he was no longer, and he was this extraordinary visionary designer who couldn't quite change with the times, unfortunately.
And also he, I would say, invented the idea of not only fashion, but fashion as a way of living, right? Because he also launched the fragrances, and he had the Atelier Martin, so he also did furniture. So he was a real complete fashion designer, the way that we have it now. For instance, Ralph Lauren was the first one who really embraced this idea, but the first one was Paul Poiret.
Yeah, he really invented the blueprint of modern fashion. That was actually won by Lily Langtry, the previous one, who was a very famous courtesan in London. And again, he realized the cult of celebrity very early on, so he used a lot of famous actresses as his models.
Yes, and he's the one who invented la jupe culotte, the first pants. And he created a huge sensation also in Italy. I did a little search, and I found out that in Turin, in 1911, Turin was the capital of this second expo fair. And in the French pavilion, Poiret showed the jupe culotte. And 3 or 4 days after, a Turinese lady, Turin was a very important fashion capital in Italy. Especially at the beginning of the century. And this lady walked in the street wearing this jupe culotte, and it was almost arrested. It was almost attacked by the crowd, and she had to, rescue in a palazzo. The concierge took her in this palazzo and protected her for at least 2 or 3 hours. And then, the crowd disappeared, and she could go home. So yeah, but Poiret was, and he also launched the Orientalistic fever, right?
I think that's where he got the jupe culottes from. Really, was more Orientalism than the idea of women's liberation. It was more about clinging to this idea of the Orientalism, and he also put women in hobble skirts as well. So he freed women from the corset, but also hobbled them by putting them in skirts they couldn't walk in. So it was a contradiction.
The exhibition organized by the Costume Institute are, normally they have a sponsor, and the main, which sometimes is a designer, and the main funding of the costume comes from the fashion industry. So the question is, can the sponsor have a curatorial voice?
No, it's written to the contract that we have complete curatorial autonomy over the narrative, the selection of the objects, but also the narrative and the interpretation of the objects. So we're pretty strict on that.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because, for instance, this exhibition was sponsored by Balenciaga. That was designed by then by Nicolas Ghesquière. So sometimes I'm wondering how free you can be, and that's okay, good. And an exhibition that I personally really like among the many that you have curated is this one, Manus per Machina, Fashion in the Age of Technology. So it's a complex exhibition that really explores how designers are reconciling the handmade and the machine-made in haute couture and in avant-garde prêt-à-porter. So how did you come up with this idea?
This was really looking into our archive, and I was working on a paper on Yves Saint Laurent's famous Mondrian dress. And I was working with the conservator, and it just came as a surprise that about 96% of the stitching was all done by machine rather than by hand. It's finished by hand, but the majority of the work was all done by machine, which makes sense to get the sort of seamlessness of the lines. So it really started from that idea, and a lot of the haute couture, a lot of the focus of the haute couture is the idea of this garment being hand sewn directly for the client. Whereas what I was finding was in ready-to-wear, there was almost more hand in ready-to-wear than the machine. So in a way, it was trying to demythologize the sort of the tropes of the haute couture, but also to talk about how the distance between the haute couture and ready-to-wear was really diminishing. And high-end ready-to-wear and haute couture, there was very little difference between the two, apart from the fact that with haute couture is made specifically for an individual client. But the idea of a garment being handmade, and the idea of the preciousness of that, I found really compelling, because sometimes it's more expensive to do something by machine than by hand. So I think it was really to try and demythologize and debunk some of the mythologies around both the haute couture and ready-to-wear.
For instance, at Dior, I don't remember which one it was, the other one, juxtaposed.
Hussein Chalayan. This was a piece this is Dior's very famous bar suit, became known as the New Look. On the left-hand side, the right-hand side is dressed by Hussein Chalayan, but it was actually mechanical, so it morphed from Dior's New Look into Paco Rabanne's metal dress. And this was a piece that looked at pleating as one of the petit man workshops of the haute couture, and this is actually Claire McCardle. Sorry,
Fortuny?
No. Mary McFadden.
Mary McFadden.
And Mary McFadden was interesting because the Fortuny pleating was all done by hand, and it was silk. So if you got caught in a rainstorm where you sat down, the pleats really would flatten out, and you'd send them back to Venice to be repleated. What Mary McFadden did was actually create a formula where the pleats were permanently held. Primarily with the use of plasticity in the dress, and then we have Issey Miyake, and what he did was actually print, or pleat, should I say, actual garments. So he instead of putting material through the pleating machine, he put actual garments through the pleating machine. Usually 3 or 4 times the size. Originally, it would shrink down to a smaller size. So it was a nice progression from Fortuny, Mary McFadden, and Issey Miyake.
This is what's the name? Is
Madame Gray.
Yes, Madame Gray and
Iris Van Herpen.
Iris, right.
And the Iris Van Herpen piece is actually 3D printed. So this is the idea again of the ultimate expression of a pleat that's permanently held in place through 3D printing.
How long did it take for you to organize this show?
They always take about a year. So this one, as soon as one exhibition closes, we start on the other. So it's about 9 months to a year.
And the percentage of the clothes that you took from the costume, and the other from
archives. This is probably about 60% came from the Met's archive, and 40% came from designers.
So it's a lot.
So it's a lot from our archive. Yeah. These both came from our archive, and actually, when we bought the Iris Van Herpen, so all these 3 belong to the museum.
In 2008, Andrew organized his second solo exhibition after Anglomania, and he devoted to the superheroes. And there was an exhibition that was extremely popular and brought to the Costume Institute a very wide audience. And also, it was an interesting exhibition because it was a huge departure by the lavish historical surveys that the Costume Institute was very famous for. So, are you crazy for superheroes? What did you find so interesting, the superheroes in this context with fashion?
I do love superheroes, and with this, it seemed like a trite idea for an exhibition, but the whole point of the exhibition was comparing superheroes, or looking at superheroes as, in a way, as the ultimate expression of the transformative possibilities of fashion. So in a way, they were a metaphor for fashion. I remember Philippe de Montebello, who was the director at the time. He came through the morning the show opened, and he went, "What have you done to my museum?" He was horrified by the pop nature of the exhibition. But in a way, this was a very difficult show to curate because we had to work directly. You asked the question about curatorial autonomy.
Yes.
And this is probably the only exhibition where we had to run all of the text past DC and Marvel. DC and Marvel, quite rightly, are very controlling over the image of their superheroes. So the exhibition, so we had to, they agreed to lend their costumes on the proviso that they would actually read the text and approve the text, which is something we found difficult to approve, but we had to. And it was based around, the whole show was based around particular bodies. So we had Captain America as being the patriotic body. And the two characters that we had the most difficulty was the Hulk, and the Hulk, I called it the phallic body, and the idea of Bruce Banner sort of really transforming into this tumescent sort of figure, and they refused the title phallic body, so we called it the virile body, and. They also, in part of the text, we talk about how how Bruce Banner becomes this walking erection, basically the Hulk, and they said absolutely no way. So we said tumescent. So the thesaurus became really helpful, that particular one, and then the other one was Catwoman. They refused to admit that the catsuit that she wears was fetishistic. They said absolutely not. There's not a fetishistic body. So we called it the paradoxical body. So it was interesting. It was extraordinary though, because it made you think differently about your thesis, and often those compromises actually do improve the thesis.
Yeah. 3 years ago, you did China Through the Looking Glass, a big success with more than 800,000 visitors. And this exhibition surpassed the previous exhibition in terms of records of attendance, and the previous exhibition was Alexander McQueen. So I loved this exhibition because it was also a work with different curatorial departments. It was the first time that you interacted with different departments. So how did you put everything together?
I think that we'd done a show earlier called Dangerous Liaisons, which we worked with European Sculpture and Decorative Arts. It was a much smaller exhibition, but it was a collaboration with ESDA and ours, where we put mannequins in the Met Galas in the French period rooms, and it was all based on erotic literature, based on the particular novel called La Petite Maison. And with this one, we collaborated with our colleagues in the Asian art department. And again, it's really interesting because we work at a very different pace from our colleagues in the rest of the museum. So it's a much more accelerated pace in terms of our department. There's always a sort of nervousness around fashion within the Met and the role of fashion within an art museum context and how fashion will be integrated within the permanent collection. So it's always a concern of curators, and our colleagues in the Asian art department shared some of those concerns originally, and they're also a little bit nervous about the thesis of the exhibition because it was based about Orientalism, but really focusing on Edward Said's idea of Orientalism, but also going a bit beyond that and talking about some of the myths that are created about China. That it was a reciprocal sort of conversation. So the idea, for example, of willow pattern, that came out of a cyclical. It started off in Islam, and then it went to China, then to England, and England transformed it a little bit, and they went back to China. So it was a cyclical sort of arrangement. So it was really about communication and dialogue, and again, trying to debunk some of the sort of stereotypes in a way, but also show how those stereotypes are created through shared conversations.
The exhibition was gigantic. And look at these mannequins, beautiful. There were different mannequins, not the same. We have, also you have porcelain mannequins, right? That were not here, but, you know, mimicking the porcelains that they were displaying nearby.
I think the nicest thing about this show was working with Wong Kar-wai, the film director Wong Kar-wai, and I think one of the favorite parts of my job is collaborating with external creatives. So we worked with Baz Luhrmann on Scap and Prada, with Wong Kar-wai in this particular exhibition. And again, part of the exhibition was looking at how film is this carrier of meaning, this carrier of stereotypes. So using film footage really from the 20th century onwards, and how film became this vehicle to translate particular notions of China.
And Anne-Marie Wong, for instance, was a very famous star who starred in this kind of oriental craziness in Hollywood.
And this one was based on The Last Emperor, Bertolucci's The Last Emperor.
Alexander McQueen, Savage Beauty. 2011, and this exhibition created a huge sensation. Also due to the fact that McQueen committed suicide a year before. And it was one of the blockbuster exhibitions that you organized. And it's also traveled at the V&A, at Victoria and Albert Museum in 2015, and it became the most popular exhibition attended at the V&A. So it was, you know, a huge success. How did you approach this enormous creative body of work of this genius?
I mean, it was, first of all, it was important. I mean, when he first passed away, he took his life, I approached the director with the idea of an exhibition on Alexander McQueen, and he was very nervous about it. He thought it was too soon to do a show so quickly after his passing. But it was so important for me to work with his team. McQueen had a very small, intimate and loyal team. And I wanted to work with them directly. I always think that, you know, when you leave something so much later, there's so much revisionism that goes on. And it was important to tap into the sort of rawness and the emotions of McQueen's passing. So the immediacy was important for me. And then in terms of the narrative, when I began going through the archive, I saw the archive in London, and you know, with most incredible artists, you know, he wasn't consistent in his brilliance. So some collections were better than others, and I thought if we were to do something chronological, it wouldn't reflect so well on him. So we decided to do it thematically, and we came up with this idea of the sublime, which really, you know, when you went to a McQueen show, it was extraordinary in terms of how he would transport you, and this complete mixture of emotions. You know, you sometimes feel sort of unnerved, sometimes you feel immense love and immense passion. So there was all this mixture of emotions. It's sort of like being on a precipice of a mountain and seeing sort of like this idea of being confronted with the idea of the sublime. So the sublime really was the idea into the exhibition. And then we expanded it more out into 19th century romanticism. He really was the sort of Byron of his day. So we really used that idea, this Byronic figure, and the 19th century romantic movement and the role of the sublime in his work.
Also, the way you displayed things were extraordinary. This also cabinet of curiosity that you decided to create. How come, you know, for the first time you also see a lot of accessories that he created, and shoes and.
This bit was my favorite because it was like going into his mind. You know, it really was going into the brain of McQueen, and he always would say that. His fashions were, in a way, like therapy, that he would really use his fashions as a way to talk about his inner demons. And you really got that impression when you went into the Cabinet of Curiosities. You saw both, you know, the pain that he suffered. You saw the immense imagination. And, you know, McQueen was a very rare designer in terms of the fact that it's very rare to sort of be confronted with a design who moves you, who really does move you emotionally. And I think that's what people responded to in the exhibition. Obviously, the poignancy of his death, but also the fact that, there was raw emotion in the works he created. He was almost like a shaman. He had that shamanistic aspect to his work.
Yeah, I agree.
And you responded really on a purely emotional level to his work.
So far, we have seen a retrospective of a specific designer, like this one, and the other exhibition that are focused on a theme where, fashion is dissected in an unexpected way, like China or, Manus per Machina. So what, as a curator, which one do you prefer to do?
My goodness. It depends on the designer. But I think I like mixing. I'm not a great fan of when you work with one single designer. I'm not a great fan of sort of a chronological approach. I always think you learn more from a thematic approach.
It's much more interesting.
It's more interesting as a curator. I think is to approach it that particular way, which is what we did for Rei Kawakubo.
Yes.
With that, we didn't really have a choice for that one. I think that her early work she didn't want to show, and that she was the second living designer that we focused on at the Metropolitan Museum. The first being Yves Saint Laurent,
and that Lavrillan did back in the 70s.
In the 70s, and late 70s, and Rei Kawakubo really did warrant a monographic exhibition on her work. And Harold always says, never work with your heroes. And with Rei, it was interesting because she's very silent about her work. She doesn't talk about her work. She never discusses it. So as a curator, you have this, this sort of idea of working with a designer and getting to know the designer really well, and having this sort of like
this is
intimate
Kawakubo.
Relationship where you understand her clothing more. And I think the interview that helped me the most when I was reading about Rei Kawakubo was when she just did her Lumps and Bumps collection, her most famous collection. Which is this collection here. And she was being interviewed by Susanna Frankel. Rei walked into the room and silently, and Susanna asked her, what does your collection mean? What was the collection about? And Rei sort of sighed and got a pencil, drew a circle on a piece of paper and walked out of the room. And Susanna sort of saw it as a sort of the inscrutability of Rei Kawakubo, but in actual fact, what was extraordinary is the circle in Japanese means emptiness, and it was an invitation, I feel, for Rei to ask Susanna to empty her mind and to look at the work afresh with a new lens, and not bring any of your associations or references to her work. It's a very Buddhist sort of philosophy. So that's what I used for the exhibition, was really focusing on this idea of mu and ma, the idea of emptiness, and how that is really the key to Rei's work.
So he made the impossible possible. That was a huge task. And he also did another impossible thing that he made it possible, and it is this one, this exhibition, Prada and Schiaparelli, that he aptly named The Impossible Conversation. And it was a visual dialogue between two Italian designers, one who's absolutely alive and the other one that is long time dead, about their, common thread that you can find in their work. So tell us again how you came up with this, idea.
This was inspired by, in the 1930s, Vanity Fair did a series of cartoons by Miguel Covarrubias. And they were called impossible interviews. So it was people like Schiaparelli and Stalin, Duke of Windsor and Hitler. Actually, that's not so impossible. But there was those types of impossible conversations. And it really was inspired by that. This was a show we did after the McQueen exhibition. So it was important for me to focus on women designers. And it was important also to focus on designers who really weave in incredibly complex narratives in their work, but still make the clothes very wearable. And one of the sort of comments about the McQueen show was that he's an artist, and the materials he used. Sometimes it's easy to send a dress down the runway made out of razor clamshells than to send down a dress that's wearable, but it has incredibly complex narratives about gender and identity and ethnicity. So I wanted to focus on women designers who work with realistic clothes, but nevertheless imbue their clothes with really complex concepts and narratives. And the idea was to have two women, two Italians, two feminists, And what was interesting to me was how they both arrived at very similar conclusions in their work through different avenues. In actual fact, the missing link in this conversation is Yves Saint Laurent. So it should have been more of a ménage à trois than a tête-à-tête.
Yes.
But in a way, Saint Laurent was the sort of bridge between the two, because Mucci is heavily influenced by Saint Laurent. Saint Laurent was heavily influenced by Schiaparelli. So often, she always, Mucci always said that Schiaparelli has no influence on my works whatsoever, but Saint Laurent does. But just unconsciously, she was looking at Schiaparelli through Saint Laurent's eyes. So it was a really interesting sort of take on it, and it was a series of conversations between Mucci, and there was a series of films that Baz Luhrmann created with Mucci playing herself, and then Judy Davis playing Schiaparelli.
Andrew was also an actor, actually not an actor, but he acted in a movie. He acted in a movie called documentary, First Monday of May, which is a nice way to name the gala, the Costume Institute Gala that takes place every year in May. And since Anna Wintour took over, she revolutionized immediately the soiree. And she made it very star-studded kind of event that you cannot miss, at least on Instagram, because if you're not invited, you cannot go. So let's have a quick look at watch the trailer.
Fashion can create a dream, create a fantasy. It's the kind of theater.
The Met Ball is the Super Bowl of social fashion events.
The star of this evening is Andrew Bolton.
This show is going to be controversial, but I'm not afraid of controversy.
Andrew is the real visionary. It's rare to find someone so creative that they change the way you look at art. It's the biggest show we've ever done.
Huge.
We want to be careful between the costumes that we don't completely obscure the Chinese works of art.
It's not Disneyland.
There is the perennial debate about whether fashion can ever be art.
What we do is applied art.
I never dream that my clothes should be in a museum.
You need the mixture of art and commerce.
Anna's gift is to cross-fertilize. It's like a giant aquarium on that night.
Beyonce, Kim and Kanye, Chastain, Julianne Moore.
I thought he wasn't coming.
I know, but then he decided he wanted to come.
Okay, can you not be on his cell phone the entire time then?
Loud and clear.
There's a lot of political hurdles. Some of the topics that the exhibition is addressing could be interpreted as being racist.
This is just going to look like a Chinese restaurant.
We're on a super tight time frame.
We have a lot to do.
Rihanna, we can't lose her, right? We just didn't realize how expensive.
We have basically 2 days to install the whole exhibition. We're driving everyone crazy.
I don't know what to do. We just don't have the seats.
We just underestimated the scale of the show.
And then Jennifer Lawrence says, "Ladies and gentlemen, Rihanna."
Wow!
Oh my God.
Got a party tonight.
This is the queen of the night.
Sense of mystery and danger.
This room is a dream.
I think fashion should be recognized.
What's up, Maple?
When it touches people and moves people. I mean, what more can you ask from art?
So, how do you cope in general with deadlines?
Badly. I always like having as much time as possible before you can make the final decision. So it's really about having as much time to think about things and then making the decision right at the last minute. So it really is how the shows come together.
How many hours do you sleep the night before the party?
The gala. Well, actually, for this one, not very. For the Heavenly Bodies, not very much, because it was a difficult show to install because it's all in the major areas of the museum.
So the traffic. I mean, you have people coming and going, right, during the day.
Absolutely, and we covered everything in a white Tyvek leading up to the exhibition, so it looked like a Christo installation before the show opened. And then after the last visitor left at 5:45, we had to unravel all of the garments. So that was a particularly sort of late night. I think we were there at like 2:30 in the morning. But yeah, but the energy is extraordinary the day before.
Last question, and I know that this is an impossible question to ask, but I'm gonna ask it anymore. I mean, no matter what. The new exhibition that you're gonna curate. So first of all, when you're gonna announce the new exhibition?
I think it's going to be the 9th of October, I think, or the 10th.
Okay.
Around that time.
And you cannot tell, of course, the subject of this exhibition.
No, but it's sort of there's threads in the current exhibition that you can see in the show that's going to be opening. And we always try to put on exhibitions that are timely and that have some sort of contemporary relevance. And I'm hopefully this one, I think, may be very timely with what's happening in culture at the moment.
Okay, we can start beating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, let's say if you have a couple of questions to ask, Andrew, yes. When? Yes.
In Heavenly Bodies or any other show, there are pieces that you wanted to have that you couldn't or had to cut or couldn't get?
There usually is in most exhibitions, and now that fashion's become so popular in other museums, the competition for particular pieces is really intense, which is great because it shows the popularity of fashion and its importance in sort of contemporary culture. But for Heavenly Bodies, we were really lucky in terms of most of the pieces we requested. We were able to borrow. There was one piece actually from the Vatican that we wanted, which was a ring. And it was an extraordinary ring that was originally made for Pope Pius IX, and they said actually no, you can't borrow. You can't.
Actually, a fashion.
He was
quite a dandy.
It was a dandy.
A fashion conoscente.
And it was a ring that was made for him, and they said we couldn't borrow that because it's given to the next pope. So if for any reason Pope Francis passed away, they would need the ring for the next pope. So I was the only one they said no to. Well.
Yes. Where is the microphone?
Here. Coming through.
Thank you.
Is your inspiration always kind of what's going on, or how do you get your inspiration? Do you have like a brainstorming idea with all your team, and you all say, "Wow, that's a great idea. Let's do China."
And it really comes out of. Really what's happening in culture. It really is a direct response to that. So with the next exhibition, it's timely, I think, in particularly what's happening in culture. But with the China show, for example, it was based on the fact that there were so many designers who were showing in China. Chanel, Valentino were creating these capsule collections just for the Chinese market, and the importance of China and also the interest of China within fashion. So it really came out of that idea, and then with Impossible Conversations, that was a deliberate decision to focus on women designers post McQueen exhibition. It was a quieter show as well, and I think Mutual was very brave to follow McQueen because it was a concern of hers, and I think it was still one of my favorite shows. It's one of the most poetic shows we did, I think. So we tried to mix it up as well between monographic and thematic to try and have a dynamic program of exhibitions. But to answer your question, it's primarily what's happening in culture.
Here and the gentleman in the back later.
Good evening. As an anthropologist, what do you think today's art scene and the classical scene and your Monday says about our culture and how we are fixated with watching people parading their clothes and themselves?
It's never really changed. Fashion's always been partly about celebrity. It's just the fact that celebrities are changing. So when you think back in the 1950s, in Marala Agnelli, Jacqueline de Rive, they were the sort of celebrities of their day. I think that what's changed is how people dress. Those women dressed themselves. They had their own specific sense of style. I think what's different is that people are relying on stylists. So it's not really about their own self-expression. It's about what the stylist thinks or what provides. So I think the main difference is, women previously would dress themselves and have a very definite idea about their identity and their self-presentation, and now the reliance on stylists creates a sort of maybe a less interesting way of dressing.
Back, the guy with the white shirt. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. My question is about when you and your team are considering a new acquisition for the permanent collection. What is it that you look for, and what is also the process of acquiring that? Is it directly from a house? Do you go to the store? How does that happen?
It really varies. The ideal is to purchase the piece directly from the designer, so a runway sample, in terms of the fact that it's really the truest expression, the truest form of their poetic expression. So we always try and get a runway sample. Usually when a garment's sort of created for a client, there's various tweaks, and it becomes a dialogue between the client and the couturier or the designer. So we really try to focus on the artistry of the design, the intentionality of the designer. So that's really our ideal. We also hunt women of style. So Marala Agnelli is somebody that we would love her wardrobe. We've purchased things from Anna Piaggi, the great style icon Anna Piaggi. Lady Amanda Harlick is somebody who's got an extraordinary sort of personal sense of style. In terms of the criteria, it's really looking at designers who are advancing fashion in some form or another, whether it's about technique, advancing a technique. Someone like Elia, for example, was somebody who was almost fetishistic about technique. He would really continue to refine his technique throughout his career. So he was a true technician. On the other side, you have someone like Rei Kawakubo, who's more about conceptualism and more the conceptual side of fashion, but still advancing fashion through ideas. So it's really looking at designers who are trying to advance fashion and really challenge what we mean by fashion, challenge what our expectations are.
Last question to the director of Casa Italiana.
Thank you. What a privilege. And thank you so much for sharing with us your creative strategy and your ideas and what you brought to the Met and to the entire city and to the entire community. My question brings us back to Heavenly Bodies. And in the different interpretations that arise about the exhibit, it's desecrating, the other one is exploitative. And I think you came up with a very interesting interpretive analysis that is nostalgia. Most of these designers are Catholics or fallen Catholics, but they bring back to with their creations a nostalgia of their past, of their childhood, of what they saw as children. And I was fascinated by the idea of how nostalgia played a role in triggering their creative ability to start from that and come up with something else.
Absolutely, because I think that's what was interesting is, you again, as a curator, you're always interested in what drives an artist's creativity. And I never thought it would be their religious background. And what was really interesting working on the exhibition was, you'd speak to people like Pier Paolo.
Pier Paolo Piccioli is the guy who designs Valentino.
And Jean-Paul Gaultier. And initially they would refuse and say, absolutely not, religion has no influence over my work. And slowly they began to think about it. And they said, actually, it really is one of the defining characteristics of my creative process. And the show is called Heavenly Bodies, the Catholic Imagination. And the Catholic Imagination was a term that Andrew Greeley and David Tracy created, and to talk about how Catholics see the world and the storytelling traditions within the Catholic tradition. And that really resonated. You know, when you look at most of the designers in the exhibition, McQueen, Pierpaolo, Tom, they tell stories through their work. So this idea of the storytelling tradition within Catholicism has really had an impact on their creativity. So for me, I was so fascinated how, you know, they're being brought up a Catholic and that storytelling tradition, the idea of metaphor, how that plays a role in their work, and it really has sort of affected their creative impulses.
Thank you very much. You have 3 more weeks to go back to the cloister and to the Met. Thank you.